Turkey has basically come full circle, and since 2012, President Erdogan has had a big sort of interest in removing Assad from power. And right now, I think they've got their sights set on two major things, one of which is essentially the return or repatriation of Syrian refugees inside of Turkey back to Syria, somewhere between 3 to 4 million. And on the tail end of that, they're really keen on essentially preventing the formation of a Kurdish statelet along Turkey's southern border, which would occupy essentially Syria's northern sort of area, which is currently an autonomous zone administered by Syrian Kurds.
So let's take those things one at a time. Those Syrians who are refugees in Turkey, how likely is it that they're going to get this mass return into Syria, given the uncertainty within Syria right now in terms of its future?
That's a great question. I mean, who knows? When you have 3 or 4 million refugees inside of a country such as Turkey, a lot of them have been there for a long time, and some have actually, born there and they've set up lives there. I understand there's a lot of resistance and reticence to actually going back to a country which they had to flee from for their lives. But also the uncertainty from the perspective of anyone there is basically, look, you've got, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which has its links obviously not only to Al-Qaeda, but it is actually rooted in its historical roots to the Islamic State, which it disavowed from. You would have to ask yourself the question, to what extent would they feel safe going back to an entity, a state entity, which may or may not be governed by an organization that is still widely considered to be a terrorist entity by many governments as well as the United Nations. So, that's a very, very difficult decision to make.
And of course, you mentioned there Turkey in terms of what it thinks about the Kurdish entities in Syria. How difficult is it to balance that, given those entities' relationships with international players like the United States?
Again, I think it's very difficult. I mean, there's been a widespread sort of, I would say, reasonably accurate reporting suggesting that Erdogan greenlit this sort of major uprising, both from the perspective of HTS as well as the Syrian National Army. And if that's the case, well, you would think that he might have some sort of control over the outcome of what happens in Syria next. What kind of state does it become? And I'm not necessarily sure he's in a position to control that, because HTS and SNAs may have differing goals or sort of aspirations as to what they do with the state next. As far as the Syrian Kurds are concerned, that's very difficult. I mean, they are backed by the United States. And right now, the Pentagon just announced today that they've carried out over 70 airstrikes against Islamic State targets, which seems to have begun sort of the process of resurgence. And if the SDF is targeted by Turkey, which it has been over the last several years, that's going to cause a problem. And so all eyes are essentially on what Turkey does in its positioning towards Kurds and how the Kurds sort of position themselves against sort of HTS, SNA sort of rebels. They've been reported sort of elements of fighting and skirmishes between the Kurds and the SNA. Where will that lead? We just don't know at this point. So it's all up in the air and very fluid at the moment.
And of course, the sidelining of Russia brings Turkey to the fore in terms of its role as a player in the region now. What is it going to do with that role, do you think?
Well, I mean, yes, I agree to a point that Russia has been sidelined, but the other part of the equation, as far as Turkey and Russia are concerned, is Turkey is heavily indebted and heavily dependent on Russia. I'm not so sure as Turkey can act independently or contrary to Russian views, no matter how weakened Russia is, simply because Turkey is tied to Russia in terms of natural gas needs to the tune of about 40%. Russia is building Turkey's entire nuclear power capability. Turkey relies on Russia for agricultural trade. So, President Putin has had the opportunity and demonstrated the opportunity to take punitive action against Erdogan in the past. So, I think, we have to be tempered about how sort of, how many options Erdogan has in order to act freely independent of Russian concerns, even that of Iranian concerns, I would say. But yes, the overall point taken is, Erdogan seems to be in an emboldened position, to say the least.